Hello everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in gaming, how they work, and why we love them. As always, I'm your host, Greg, and with me, as also always, is my co-host, Mark. Except he's not, because I am alone tonight, and that is going to be the theme for the rest of this hour, which is going to be Greg talking to you directly. Mark is, actually he's probably asleep right now, because he has to work early in the morning and it's late. But we could not find a time, due to just life getting in the way, to do something this week where the both of us could do it, and it made the most sense for me to do it. So, last time when Mark did this is my first ever solo cast. When Mark did this, he plays a Factorio for you all, and did the streaming thing, which worked for him. I, unfortunately, am working with the computing power of roughly a potato in my very, very well-loved and dropped several times 4 gigs of RAM in my 2011 MacBook Pro, which is already angry at me simply for recording my voice. So, this is all I can give you. Fortunately, this is what I'm better at as well, in terms of talking. And we will be going through and discussing actually a stream that we did last week. Hopefully for the end of the year, if you haven't heard, we're going to be doing, the theme for the end of the year is going to be the end of games, and particularly how to end games well and the way the different games end, and just why that seems to be a really, really hard thing for games. In fact, normally we're going to be doing an intro to that this week, unfortunately without Mark here. I'm not going to try to tackle that entirely by myself. But rather go through something that I noticed in our playthrough, or the very beginnings of our playthrough, of the game Undertale last week, which was what we streamed. We only streamed about an hour of it. That was an absolute nightmare of technological issues, trying to do the dual streaming thing. Mark got some new toys, and long story short, we didn't need all the new toys, and reverted back to our previous setup, because Undertale is such a simple game. But that was not without, 2.5 hours worth of trial and error. So, in any case, we are playing Undertale. We'll be able to finish that before the end of the year. We picked it in large part because of its reputation for having an excellent ending, and for being a very, very impressively written game. Narrative is something that both Mark and I love, as well as being rather short and very streamable. So we're going to try to finish that by the end of the year, and then we can start a new theme come January 1st. But we got through about probably the first hour, I would say, hour 20 minutes maybe, of the game, and it is, for those of you who don't know, is a very, there'll be first hour spoilers here, in case you haven't seen the stream. That's all going to be up on our Twitch channel, at Gaming Mechanics, if you'd like to go watch it. But, it's a really interesting game. I mean, honestly, it's, having been talking about games now for, on air for, 20 plus weeks, / having been playing them my whole life, I haven't really played an RPG like it. It's an RPG open world dungeon crawler bullet hell, I guess, would be the best way to put it. I don't know. It's a very odd combination of things. It's obviously written by... It's another one of those kind of almost single dev games, where it was pretty much written, masterminded, directed, and put together by one guy with some help. And it's a really interesting game, both tonally as well as just even the mechanics of it. I wasn't a huge RPG, or traditional RPG fan, at least in terms of, say, like the classic Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy kind of JRPG, turn-based combat exploration sort of thing. I didn't play too many of those. I played a little bit of kind of some of the more the Western-ish RPGs, like Third Age, turn-based, Lord of the Rings combat, or kind of lighter RPG action games. As they went. So, in any case, it's far more. It's very clear that it's played and made by someone who did RPGs and played a lot of them, and wanted to make a unique one. And so the thing that I noticed at least at the point that we came to a point where we had the option to go forward, and if we were to do that, we would lose access to everything that we'd done before. So the whole area that we had. It was open. We could traverse it as much or as little as we wanted, and there were different enemies and puzzles and whatnot, and characters that we could interact with to our heart's content. But we reached a point where, to move forward in the game, we had to go past this, and then it was made very clear that we would not be able to return to this area again. And this has both narrative significance as well as mechanical significance, obviously. And that struck me as, well, one, that's a bare minimum tie-in to our theme of ending, because that is a small little end. See what I did there. But also, it struck me that it's actually something that's pretty darn common in single-player games, which is this point of no return or gated kind of area content. Normally, gated content refers to something more in an MMO-ish or grindy kind of game where there's certain content you can only play if you have the requisite amount of experience or reputation with a certain faction or the certain type of gear or certain gear level or yada yada yada. And until you reach that point, you can't play the content. That's not what I'm talking about in this case. I'm talking more in terms of content that was previously accessible and then becomes inaccessible as you play the game more. So actually the opposite. Like I said, when I was thinking about it, particularly with games that I played and loved growing up, this is not an uncommon thing. I think it's become uncommon, certainly more recently, as I was thinking about why I was surprised by this, basically, when we were playing it. And it said, hey, you can't go back. And that got me thinking, in large part, just about kind of the big push as of late, in AAA games particularly, but I think really across the board, of everything needing to be open world. We talk about buzzwords a lot here, and why I tend to not like them, or at least big kind of industry trends that seem to be very vogue, and when done well are fantastic. AKA Skyrim was kind of a pioneer, where when Skyrim dropped, people were blown away by it, and it was one of the most successful games of all time in a lot of ways. And then everyone sought to emulate that and the success and said, hey, well, Skyrim was open world, let's do that too. And of course, you've had very notable examples that have succeeded, such as The Witcher 3, this year even, being a prime example of that. Obviously, think about big games like Red Dead Redemption or GTA, that series. The way Metal Gear Solid has reinvented itself with the Phantom Pain recently. That was a previously non-open world game that became open world, in large part to great success. Or games such as Shadow of Middle-earth, or Shadow of Mordor, rather. The original release and its sequel, Shadows of War, that came out this year. Those are both very much open world, sandboxy types of games. And those are, like I said, not necessarily bad. I think there's a lot of bad ones. The easiest example of, massive sandbox failure is, of course, continues to be No Man's Sky. Kind of the picture of user-generated content gone wrong, where you have basically unlimited content to work with, and almost none of it is worth working with. That is the ultimate fear, when you have all this content and none of it is actually worth using. So the point being that seems to be a big trend, that open-worldness, that need to be able to play everything at every point in time, and never really having any huge amount of... having some semblance of gated material in terms of, at least if there's a narrative, if there's a single-player mode. Of course, that has to be, linear in terms of progression. But in large part, to be able to go and do kind of whatever you want at any point in the game. And I'm not necessarily convinced, actually. Breath of the Wild is another great example of a series in terms of Zelda that wasn't previously classically open world in terms of being able to go anywhere, do anything at any point, not having any locked areas, and made its transition into literally the whole game world was open from the very beginning. And having some soft caps on it, but in large part being able to go anywhere, do anything. And so yeah, I'm maintaining that that's not necessarily... It's not necessarily good or bad. Like I said, there's great examples of it, there's poor examples of it. But I think there is something lost when every single game is trying to do just that and only that. Previously on gaming mechanics. No, previously just in the world of gaming. But back before, I think in large part the reason you didn't see this, and the reason we see it now, is just a technological advance. The fact that we now have the computing power to be able to simulate entire large open worlds and have the ability to create things that are so dynamic and interesting and can change over time, so that if you go to the same place in that world multiple times, you can have something different happen, right? That didn't used to be the case. And in fact, it's only a very recent thing that has been. In large part, you had to, in order to build replayability into your game, you couldn't have this kind of just non-traditional cyclical gameplay where you can just kind of go out and do anything that you want and it's fun. Before that, you actually had to have pretty darn strict limitations of precisely what you could do in certain areas, and then move on from that area. And again, another theme we've talked about before, but the idea that limitation fosters creativity, being a very important thing for game design. Rules are fun. I wonder, and I always try to be intentional with my language when I say stuff like that, because I don't know this for sure. It's more a sense, but I do wonder if there is some level of that being lost, right? Where when you have a very, very specific goal for an area, if you need to make it accessible to the player at every single point in the game, regardless of their current power, their skills that they have, the previous experience that they have in terms of the way the game works, a new item that's equipped, right? That's got to actually necessarily, really ironically, box you into certain design things, right? It's the same problem that card games have as they continue to expand. That's why Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone had to adopt a season-based system, because as you begin adding more and more things, more and more cards to the layout, all the possibilities become actually very, very advanced and very difficult to control for. And as you're designing new cards, you're actually boxed in, ironically, by your lack of clear boundaries of what's going to be used. When everything can be used altogether, it's very hard to make something that's new. One specific example I can think of was the charge mechanic in Hearthstone, which basically means, normally in Hearthstone, if you play out a card onto the board, a minion, it has to wait a turn before it can attack. So you have to pass your turn, your opponent gets their turn, and then you get to use your minions. The charge mechanic was just, on certain cards that had this mechanic, you could put down the card and then immediately attack with it. And this was a very, very, very powerful dynamic, still is actually, because basically a big part of Hearthstone's play was being able to play and then give time and opportunity for your opponent to counterplay against it. And the main, very, very elegant, in my opinion, design mechanic there was, hey, you can't play, you have to wait one turn before you can actually do stuff with the stuff you've played, so your opponent can, if not respond to it directly, at least prepare for it. So the charge mechanic was, when introduced, actually undercutting a very, very basic and very, very important fundamental part of the flow of what made Hearthstone a game. And unique and balanced. And so as they went on, actually the developers found it very, very difficult to design cards, particularly with the pre-existing charge cards, that were going to be balanced and fun and even playable, because eventually they got narrowed into these areas where they had to be designing around the design, or the charge mechanic, as opposed to opening them up. So I think that's just one example with a card game, but in other areas, right, you have an area, think like the Arkham games do this. I always keep on coming back to them because they're on the mind right now pretty darn well, where you have areas in the world. They're like pseudo-open world, right? They're not massive, huge. Particularly Arkham Asylum is a relatively small game, and you don't tend to do stuff around the world just for fun. Arkham City is a little bit more of that, where you can just kind of be out on patrol as Batman and it's fun, but I digress. The point is, the Arkham games do this well in that there's areas in the world that are very, if you were to be there with your full set of upgrades, or your full set of abilities, there'd be no challenge to it, right? This is and I'll get to this a little bit later, but this is why a New Game Plus environment suddenly becomes a very, very, very different way to play the game. It's a very separate idea, because if you have this one gadget, then that totally changes the whole way that you would play this area, right? Particularly in terms of any of the platforming elements. So I think what it comes down to is that you can actually have very, very specific designs for different games and different levels to get a very specific experience from the player. But to do that, you have to make them temporal. You have to make them a very specific amount of time, a very specific slice of the game. And that one way to ensure that happens is then to remove them from being able to go back afterwards. So one thing that struck me particularly with Undertale was the fact that, one, there was a very, very clear marriage of narrative and mechanic here, where we were in kind of this, not quite a tutorial zone. There's tutorial in that the main character was literally kind of talking us through how to play the game. There's a lot of fourth wall breaking in the game already, so that wasn't a really big deal. But the other point was that oh boy, what was I even saying? The narrative of the game itself was interconnected with the break. So we got to this point where we had pretty much finished our ability to learn all the things we needed to within the tutorial, and we've been exposed to what appears to be most of the major game systems, and now we need to move forward. And I haven't played much of the game past it, but it would make sense to me if coming back to this area after having been through more parts of the game would make the area not only redundant, but also actually undermine a lot of the specialness that this area had. right? The very beginning of the game is this very safe zone where you've just been, it's very unclear where you are, you've been rescued by a seemingly kind, caring being. I don't know what she is. Her name's Tariel. Tariel's Evangeline Lilly's character in The Hobbit. Toriel, maybe? Toriel, I think that's it. Real close. Anyway, she's a weird, like, motherly cow thing with horns. It's not as scary as it sounds. She's actually very, very gentle. But the whole part is her basically taking care of your child, your human child, and she's trying to take care of you. And the big, huge, dramatic scene, which was incredibly dramatic for so early on in a game, particularly the fact that they had very little time to develop the characters, just because we only had like an hour. There's a scene where you decide to leave and try to find your way back home to wherever you were before you fell down into these ruins. And it's a very horrible choice because your caretaker, this person who saved you and has been taking care of you, doesn't want you to go. She doesn't want to be lonely. And so you have to walk through this process of leaving behind your mother, basically, a pseudo-mother. And so that lines up very, very well narratively, as well as, like I said, then going back wouldn't make sense in a narrative sense in any way, shape, or form either. Because that would totally take you out of the weight of that moment. That is, like I said, significantly weighty. I was thinking about other games that did this in terms of going back and how older games, right, that particularly single-player games, would handle replayability. I talked about the New Game Plus thing. I think I narrowed that down to that really only happened maybe in the mid-2000s, mid to late 2000s. But before that, when I think of the games I grew up on in terms of like Spyro the Dragon, the old platformers, right, for PlayStation, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, Croc, what else did I play? I mean, CTR, Crash Team Racing, Echo the Dolphin was one of my favorites. That's a single-player game. And then onto the PS2 era, right? You have like Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper. Those were kind of the three main ones that were my favorites in those eras. Those games were interesting in that it would be similar. You'd play through those games, and you, in large part at least, could when you'd finish the games, particularly I remember with the Jak and Daxter series, there was the narrative, there were the main story missions, basically, the narrative-driven things that you had to do to get through the game. And then once that was done, you could usually go back and find collectibles. And that was basically it. There was no sense of playing the game again, right? Like, when I'm talking, here's a good example, right? One of the most played games I think I have, which is interesting to think about because I never really logged how many hours I played when I was a kid. Games logging their own hours are kind of a more recent thing, I would say. But in any case, I do know that I played roughly 250 hours of Shadows of Mordor when it came out in 2014. Maybe a little bit less. There's probably like 20 hours of that was my roommate, whose game that actually was. So a solid 230 hours then, which is still a lot of time. I know I played that much. And to compare, I mean, how much... I mean, those games, those early platforming games, like Jak and Daxter, or Ratchet and Clank, those guys probably ran, 15 or 20 hour tops in single player? It's funny, because when I think I had time limits on my gaming when I was a kid, right? My parents set very stringent, I could only play an hour a day, which I would usually find a way to get around. But it's just funny to think, like, yeah, I remember playing games so much when I was a kid, but it was only an hour at a time, so then once I, got into high school and then left the house, and I would play, 3, 4, or 5 hours at a time in college or whatever. That probably very quickly blew away my my childhood game times. Anyway, point is, I played a crap ton of Shadows of Mordor, right? And the first one. And I would argue that the mass majority of my time spent in that game was not any of the scripted stuff the developers made for me to play. The mass majority of my time in that game was just spent running around as Talion, murdering orcs, taking over camps, creating new nemesis, I suppose, new orc chieftains and warlords to fight, getting into big fights, hunting things, etc., etc. The actual content of the game, in terms of the campaign and then some of the side quests and the collectibles, were, I don't know, I could look it up on howlongtobeat.com. That's probably good lord, the story missions are negligible, man. You could play the whole story in like 10 hours, maybe. Not even. 5, maybe. And then to complete the rest of the side missions, that'd probably be an extra 10 on top of that. Just a hunch. Point is, nowhere near 200 hours, right? And yet, the mass majority of my time was spent not doing that. Now, I will say that's a unique example in some ways, in the fact that one huge draw of that game, right, and its place in video game history is solidified by the fact that it put in the Nemesis system, right? This idea that you had AI, personalized AI that you had specific stories with. You know, when you die to a single grunt orc, he will suddenly get a name, and he will have a personality, and he'll remember you when you see him, and you can build a relationship with them, and yada, yada, yada. And that whole system is fantastic and really fun to play with. And so that's definitely a part of that. But it's not it, right? That I didn't spend the entire time I was playing just trying to manipulate the Nemesis system. That was an added perk. But in large part, the game felt so good to me. It felt so fun. The combat itself, you know, it's similar to the Arkham games where the combat is really, really fluid, very, very viscerally satisfying. It's the first M-rated Lord of the Rings game that had been produced, so it was really fun to see orcs get absolutely eviscerated. The stealth and wraith sequences are really, really fun. You can build, you know, different builds to make sure you have unlimited arrows, or you could just indefinitely be a wraith and just teleport around a stronghold, murdering orcs from behind their back. It made you feel really good, and it also, I want to differentiate out from something else that happened. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago in terms of that. I think we were talking about loot boxes and kind of addictive grind mentality. The games can get you to play them over and over without really knowing why, or necessarily having a goal in mind, or really not playing for fun at any point. You're just kind of playing to a new arbitrary limit. And with Shadows of Mordor, I wasn't doing that at all, actually. Like I said, I unlocked everything pretty darn quick. It's a pretty easy game, actually. And the rest of it was just playing for the joy of playing. I just loved, like I said, the feeling of getting to play that game. I didn't boot it up being like, I guess I have to like log my Shadows of Mordor hours for the day, or I don't really know what else to do. I was like, no, I was playing it until I stopped having fun. Then I stopped, and apparently that was 240 hours. So my point there being that game was unique in its ability to bring in an immense amount of fun just by being like the core gameplay, right? The combat, the movement, the stealth, the environment, right? It's a very beautiful game. I'm also a huge Lord of the Rings nerd, so just getting to be in that world felt good to me. Was so darn good that the replayability was really built in, right? There was no, like I said, there was no gear grind, there's no loot grind, there was no massive amount of things that could happen randomly throughout the world that you had to kind of check off, right? The new Assassin's Creed series, in large part, has gotten a lot of heat for that. In terms of, hey, it's this big open world when you open up the map and have 5 million things on there to do, and it feels just kind of overwhelming. And it can feel more like just checking off boxes rather than actually playing just for the fun of being in the world, right? I think at its worst, the Riddler system in the Arkham games could fall into this too, where at some point that was a very, very involved exploration/collectible game that was added into the Arkham series. And at worst, that could definitely feel like an overwhelming, certainly if they had all the icons up on the map. I think there were like 450 trophies, collectibles, and riddles, and kind of environmental puzzles to solve. That would quickly become overwhelming, and no one would want to do it. So I think that's the interesting thing, when done really well, that open worldness, that replayability, where games get that, is that really core, God, you just made a really fun game to play over and over and over. And of course, throughout most of this, I've been talking about single-player games, and I think that's in large part where I'll spend most of my time. There's a discussion had too in terms of the multiplayer aspect and why that can be fun, but in large part that boils down to playing against humans is fun and chaotic, and you can never quite anticipate what's going to happen. So I'm going to get some water here and sip, because it turns out talking for 25 minutes without any breaks takes a toll. Please excuse me. I'll be right back. I'm sure Mark will cut this. Ugh. Tap water. Man, That is good. Whew. Nothing like city water, baby. Okay. So where were we? Yes, we were talking about the fact that games need to be replayable, and that is a very important part of them in general. There's also a level of open-worldness that also can be very, very fun. Now, the problem with open world can also turn into a huge kind of checkmark-based slog that is very difficult to balance for the entirety of the game. I like to think about... oh, dear. There's a large rip in one of my clothes. What was I saying? Oh yeah, the point I was going to make next was, I was just talking about Shadows of Mordor, and how it's very, very fun, and it's very easy to waste time in that. A very, very replayable game. Those previous games I was talking about, in eras before they really had the ability to be these huge, big open-world ones, like Jak and Daxter, like Crash Bandicoot, like, say, Final Fantasy VII. That's a huge game that's actually difficult to replay. The way that you replayed those games was, shocker, you just you started a new file. You just went back and you played the game again. Which sounds like anathema, probably, to a modern gamer in terms of particularly ones that are used to having new content be added every 3 to 4 weeks. Content droughts are hilarious to me because, on one hand, of course, we should be expecting very good things from the industry that makes so much money off of us, but at the same time, I'm like, geez, man, like, most of the time games are intended as a hobby, not an entire like forever game, like a lifestyle, like a lifestyle. And to produce enough content to maintain a game as a single game, at least as a lifestyle, i.e. Destiny, or any of the big MMOs, is very, very difficult. But I digress. My point was, previously, to get replayability in a game, you just went back and replayed the game. You will see that, in particularly, like I said, these single-player missions. I remember there's actually a mode in Jak 2, I believe, so that game was renowned for being open world, similar to Jak 1. Again, open world is I distinguish that sort of open world from what I think of when I hear open world nowadays. In so much as there were no levels, right? There was no, like, you had to go through a door and enter a world, and then you'd go through a door and get out of that world in the same way that you would in, like, Crash or Spyro. The whole world was interconnected, but at the same time, it was not designed to be... The main content of the game wasn't out in the open world. There were things to do throughout the game that were scripted and were developed by the developers for the player to experience. As opposed to, say, Shadows of Mordor, right, where, like I said, the majority of content in that actually is just the open world that you get to play in, and that's just fun. So, Jak 2, not necessarily an open world game, despite having a large amount of space and open, interconnected space within it. Fun fact, actually, Jak 1 was, Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy, was, I believe, one of, if not the very first game to have that be true, where it was an entire interconnected world where you could go up in the game and look out into the distance, and as far as the rendering would go, you could see a tree, and then you could go out and find that tree. It wasn't just an animation or an object that was being put onto, say, a dome. Similarly, I believe Jak and Daxter was the first or second, 2001. No, that would be before, I think. Crap. One of the two. It's either that or Warcraft 3 was the very first game to do a day and night cycle, which is really cool. Jak 2 didn't really matter, or Jak and Daxter didn't matter at all, the day and night cycle, other than aesthetics. Warcraft 3 did actually have a few mechanics that did matter whether it was night or day. Wow, it's a lot hard to keep myself on topic without Mark. Okay. My point is, replaying a game, there's a system in Jak 2 where after you played the whole game, the game didn't end, you could still walk around and do stuff in the world. However, it felt very empty. It was actually not very much fun to boot up Jak 2 after you've beaten everything, even though you have all the guns and you have all your items and all your power-ups. There's nothing to actually do. You can go around, you can hijack stuff, and you can kill enemies, but there's all of the best parts of the game are actually contained in these scripted story events. And you cannot go back and replay those once already played. So it feels like the majority of the game is actually gone, and the way that you get to do that and re-experience it is you restart the game. And you play from scratch. Now, there was actually a mode, there were collectibles in the game that you could go and find after the fact, and some of them were in places that you actually, required you to go back to, that you couldn't just get the first time around. And the way that the collectibles works is actually you would use them to buy features in the game. This sounds insane to everyone I know. Normally they're like, you just pay real money for those. But no, in fact, you could just unlock the game without paying any extra money. But you had to find stuff in the game, these collectibles. They were called orbs, precursor orbs. And one of the features you could unlock, amongst other goofy things like big head mode, which needs to make a comeback. I don't know why that ever stopped. That's a brilliant idea. Big heads are funny, no matter what game it is. Could you imagine playing Battlefront 2? Like, everyone would stop complaining about the new Battlefront 2 if they added big head mode. Seriously, like, you could charge whatever the heck you wanted on Darth Vader, and people would be like, yay, the heads are big! It's not true. But, that was one of the things. The main thing, though, was that you could actually unlock a mode that allowed you to go scroll through all of the story missions and then just select one and replay it. Exactly as it was the first time you played it, with the same upgrades and the same guns, basically, that you had when you played it the first time. And that was a huge deal to me, and I was so set on... the only reason I usually didn't like collectibles. I don't like collectible hunts. I think they're kind of boring. Jak 2 was one of the few games I did that in because I wanted to unlock that mode so I could go back and replay the game at any point. And I remember being very, very adamant and feeling very, almost like angry that I couldn't do that. Because that was the game, right? That was the game. That being said, there was something cool that happened, which was each and every event that I played there felt singular and very specific and very special. When I get into a big, huge fight, it's very difficult for me to remember what it felt like the first time I jumped into a huge orc mob in Shadows of Mordor and fought them and overcame them, and I had this sea of corpses at my feet, and I was this master of combat. I don't remember what that feels like anymore. I can do that. I can hop into the game. I can probably do that with, like, one eye closed. I will murder everyone and feel almost nothing. That's not true with Jak 2. If I go back and replay Jak 2 today, outside of the fact I haven't played that game in like a decade, if I had done that even when I was a kid and gone back and gotten to that point 50% of the way through the game when you unlock the Tomb of Mar, which is, I don't need to explain it, it's a big deal, and you get to play through the tomb, you only get to do that once. And so as you're playing it, you know that, and it was, like I said, it was one that was specifically designed for a point where you were in the game. There was no side quests. I mean, there were side quests, but there was no progression system outside of what the game gave you, and you couldn't progress past where the game wanted you to be. As well as when it was done, it was done. You couldn't go back. The world had intrinsically changed. At the end of the tomb, you collapse it, and the tomb's gone. And it's still in the world, but you can't go back in. So there's actually, in terms of narrative, there's a sense of weight there. The fact that the world has changed because of something that you've done, which isn't true in many open-world games. When you murder every single orc in a stronghold in Shadows of Mordor, it does not matter. You will leave, you will come back, and the stronghold will be exactly the same. You can't really affect the world in big open-world games. In scripted games, you can, and it certainly helps. The other thing about the experience, like I said, is that to this day, it's still, I reflect on it, it feels special. Every stage point of that game feels unique and singular. And, I don't know, maybe people just don't want that as much anymore. Maybe it's just nostalgia. Like I said, even young me wanted that ability to go back and play those modes, but even when I did unlock that with the precursor orbs that I found, I remember not playing it that much. Ironically. I think it was just more like I wanted to know I could if I wanted to, but I didn't. The way to do it was to restart the story and to re-engage the story. Now, Jak 2, like I said, those era of games like Cooper, Ratchet & Clank, in large part, are pretty darn story-based. Jak 2 being more story-based, say, than even Ratchet & Clank was. Ratchet & Clank is fun to just walk around blowing stuff up at max level once you've gotten everything. Going around blowing things up. But, at the same time, that type of game, the main core part of that game, was in fact being able to blow things up, not necessarily the narrative. That being said, there were things that were lost. Once you would beat certain bosses, you couldn't go back and play a boss. That made it feel special. Another game that honestly does this really well is Dark Souls. This game has immense replayability, if not just because it's almost goddamn impossible, but also because when you kill something, in large part, it stays dead, particularly bosses and large enemies, sub-bosses, mini-bosses. When you do something, it affects the world. And having a big interconnected world, as Dark Souls does, I don't think there's any, at least in the 20-plus hours I played of it, there wasn't any truly gated content where I couldn't go back to an area that I'd gone previously, minus maybe the tutorial area. Progression is very slow in Dark Souls too, so that kind of matters there. But in large part, Dark Souls is a very is a game that's very, very much built on its ability to be played. Crap. I totally lost my train of thought. I made it 35 minutes without needing an edit. Mark, as you are listening to this, I would ask that you edit out what I said previously. I'm going to take another sip of water. And we will re-engage, as I have a point. What was my point? It was that... Excuse me. Was that... Dark Souls, as a game, was... something. Dark Souls is very good at bleh. It's very good at being very difficult, obviously. I mean, my point was that there were no parts of Dark Souls that were impossible to go back to, but that were also... You know, I'm just going to go back and listen to it. One sec. So yeah, Dark Souls is definitely one of those games that is able to do that very well, I would say, in terms of being able to have it feel like you're having a unique effect upon the world, and that once you've cleared an area, that area has been changed. Of course, within some, like I said, in large part, normal enemies will respawn as you go back through, but that being said, it's also not the type of game that really encourages grinding or going back to places you've already been just for the sake of that, because anything can kill you in that game. So replayability, I think, so like I said, we've been talking about mostly just narrative replayability, and once the game's narration is over, that makes it really hard to come back. And I think there's a cool site called the Gama Sutra, which I cannot recommend outside of the one article I found on it as I was reading about things here. But they have a really nice article that I'm going to be pulling from about replayability. One is on narration, and one is on just the mechanics of replayability, and what is required to get you to the point where you can replay things. And they bring some really, really interesting points to bear in terms of why a game could be replayable and why another one wouldn't be. So they start off by talking a little bit about casual versus core gamers. Core gamers being ones that want to beat the game, casual gamers being ones that just want to play it for fun. That's a fine distinction. It's all just relative anyway, and I'm not going to be using it, so you can go and read that article if you'd like. However, what they do bring up is some really interesting parts here in terms of the specifics, like I said, that makes a game replayable. Basically, at the end of the day, right, in order to have a game be worth replaying again, and this comes back to kind of harkens back to the mystery of why game studios want to keep your attention even when it's not monetized, that Mark and I have been mulling over for quite a little bit of time, and I'd say it's really probably the biggest unanswered question we have here on gaming mechanics. But in any case, variety is the thing that is necessary, right? And the really easy way to do this is chance as a part of gameplay. So think going all the way back to like Monopoly, or anything that requires you to roll die, backgammon, or say, I don't know, Diablo 3. Oh man, anything loot-based, man, I'm so over in some ways. Like the looter shooters, in terms of Borderlands or Destiny, certainly the loot grinds of the MMORPGs or the ARPGs. It just seems so meh to me in terms of games. But they're very fun and addictive. So anyways, like I said, in terms of ways to keep people playing, variability and randomness, chance, are very, very key and very, very, frankly, easy ones. We talked about this a little bit last week, 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about loot boxes, the fact that there is a very large difference between the amount of time it will take Developers can buy themselves a lot of time by randomizing loot, right? If you spend X amount of minutes trying to make this single piece of loot, and then force, Y amount of minutes to get it acquired, as opposed to making it say, hey, if you do this thing, you'll get it. Gamers are really quick in figuring that out. If you say, hey, if you do this thing, you have a chance to get it, gamers will be really quick in doing it, but will still need to be able to do it over and over and over again. So you get a lot of game content, right? Well, not true content, but at least game time from randomized content. The other thing that I think was interesting in terms of this is actually more about other games like board games, but we technically are gaming mechanics, not video gaming mechanics. But changing the initial conditions of a game also make it very replayable, right? The one that's brought up, which I actually played a ton of, was one of my favorite games as a kid, particularly the Star Wars edition, which was literally just the same game except with Star Wars characters, was Stratego, which is a board game where the state of the game to start with is always unique, or maybe not unique, but always different. You set up your board, and you hide. You basically have a king piece, a flag, that you hide randomly throughout the board, and you have to find your opponent's king before they find yours. And part of the game is that initial setup. So though the game is identical in terms of its mechanics every single time, the initial condition has changed. So this is something that you see, right, when you have particularly class-based games, where the game will play very, very differently depending on... Skyrim's another good example, right? You experience literally the same exact content, but with a completely different set of initial conditions and criteria. In this case, the initial conditions tend to look like character creation, right? So playing a game as a warrior versus a rogue will feel very different. You can see this across the board in terms of MMOs, role-playing games. Like I said, these singular narrative games, however, don't really have that ability to give you a varying initial condition because of the constraints of the narrative, right? You can't play The Last of Us and instead of playing as Ethan, play as, I don't know, an elite SWAT officer and then see how the game goes that way. Yeah, it would be a different story. It'd be a completely different story, but that game hasn't been made. I think we just call those sequels. Or expansion packs. So the varying initial conditions thing, like I said, works far, far better for, I think, obviously multiplayer games to an extent, but also games that have various levels of character creation to them, giving you the chance to play the same thing in a different way. Now, that can go well or poorly in terms of how good the character creation is, right? If there's no significant difference between playing, I don't know, let's pick one at random, say, Diablo 3, a demon hunter versus a witch doctor, which I think there is. Fine, witch doctor versus a necromancer. If there's no discernible difference between playing the two of them, that's not going to last long, and surprise, surprise, that's what happened when the Necromancer was released. People would play it for a little bit, realize, hey, this feels pretty much the exact same as the Witch Doctor, and stop playing it. So let's see here. The next one, this is an interesting one in terms of replayability. Non-deterministic opponents, right? So this gets back to the multiplayer part. Chess is the example being used, right? Chess has always identical starting conditions, and basically no random elements. The one thing you could say would be who goes first. White always will go first, but in terms of the player that gets to go first, that's different. But in large part, chess is largely considered one of the most compelling, fun, competitive games because it is very, 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 very fair, right? Very skill-based. Now, the non-deterministic approach there is a very, very separate thing. The human, on the other side of it, depending on the philosophy of choice, we're just going to go ahead and say humans are not deterministic. That is a very, very important part of the game. And you see that in games like, I don't know, obviously, like I said, the multiplayer ones, but having really strong modding communities, right, for Skyrim, or obviously Minecraft, anything that's purely user-generated. EVE Online is another easy go-to one, right? Kind of these ultimate sandbox games, which, again, are, like, I want to differentiate, again, this kind of, like, the phrase open world that I seem to hate so much. EVE is a very open game. Minecraft is similarly, technically, a huge, giant open world. The difference is those games aren't the mainstay of the game. Like I said, isn't going out and finding stuff to do in the world. It is making your own story. Think of think of Assassin's Creed Origins is a great example of this. It just released recently. Is by all accounts, actually a very good game for what it is. Very polished, very beautiful. Iterated, not too much, very much the same in terms of the Assassin's Creed gameplay that has been made popular since the mid-2000s, late 2000s. But it is one of those games that is just a ton of stuff to do on it. And there's just all these different tasks, and basically you do the same thing over and over. And it feels very kind of grindy in its own way. Minecraft isn't really like that, right? EVE Online, well, EVE Online's its own animal, but in large part isn't, when it's at its best, at its good points, it's not a very grindy game in terms of when you read about, like, the really, really interesting things. Maybe the mechanics are sort of grindy in terms of the way you play the game, but the philosophy behind the game isn't that way, right? It's very spontaneous, actually. It's very creative and very up to the player. There's a whole lot of choice involved. In Assassin's Creed, you just kind of run around, and it's not just about Assassin's Creed. There's plenty of other games that do this, but you just kind of run around. There's not too much player choice or interaction or very much straight up, I don't know, creativity that's involved. You don't really have to make many choices. You just kind of have to go and do all the things. As opposed to Minecraft or EVE Online, kind of these big, huge, user-generated content games, they're not opponents, but in this case, they are non-deterministic in that the main content is being driven by the player. I think that's a big part. Another one is just sheer size, right? That's what I've been talking about with Assassin's Creed. The ability to just have a stupid amount of content in a game. Another potential critique of Witcher 3 is that as well. It can be overwhelming. It's huge. There's so much to do. Skyrim is another one. Even if you look at some early RPGs like Baldur's Gate, right? That game is gigantic. You can't really play the whole thing. You can't see the whole game in one playthrough, similar to Skyrim. So you'll play the game again. In that case, there's no gating. There's no getting back to that original theme I was talking about of where something is locked out to you. There's very little like that. It's just there's literally so much in the game that you can't see it all in one run. I think that's becoming harder and harder to do as gaming has, become a lot more popular, a lot larger, with a bigger audience, potentially even with kind of more free time in the developing world, or in not the developing world. People's leisure time has been going up, allowing for more time to give to games, so that just means that people have more time to go through these giant games. So content, I'd say that sheer size one is harder and harder to do. Also, with the rising cost of games, just adding more content is going to be more and more expensive to the point where it's not going to be quite worth it. Trying to utilize some of these other things is another part of it. Utilizing player strategy, I already talked about that. Let's see here. Cut through some of this too, Mark, if you want. In fact, I would very much say that you should, seeing as how there's plenty of downtime here. Part 1. What are the most replayable? Oh, yeah, okay. Alrighty, so I think that pretty much wraps it up on those ones, on the Game Sutra article, which is Replayability, Part 2, Game Mechanics. Very, very, it's actually quite well written. I'm gonna probably be going back there for some other ones. So for the last part here, just because it is hard to come up with things to talk about on the fly, I just went to the good old interwebs and looked through people's, this is completely non-scientific or without any sort of actual weight, but was looking at what people were talking about as their favorite, most replayable games. Obviously, there were tons of the Rocket League, or Skyrim is kind of one of the classics, Dark Souls. But I found a few in here that were interesting to me. So, within the criteria of no sports games, racing games, puzzle games, or MMOs, which pretty much sums up kind of what I was talking about, that more single-player, story-driven content that we're talking about. Fascinatingly enough, I mean, some of them, some of the main ones that were given are ones that I've played, some of them weren't. One that I totally didn't think about, and rings very true, were the God of War games. I saw a lot of Zelda-esque games, and when I say Zelda-esque, games that are very, completable, right? There aren't huge collectathons. I know I talked about that in the Arkham games a little bit, but those are actually very doable because there's ways in-game to help, that the game gives you to help find the items. They're not just randomly hidden. I mean, they are randomly hidden, but you can do things in the game that allow you to find them, direct you to them. Zelda games are similar, being able to find the chest that gives you the map where everything is. There's something very similar in the Sly Cooper games, where if you got enough things, eventually you'd be able to find all of the collectibles. You'd find a collectible that showed you where more collectibles were. So same thing with God of War. There were some collectibles in that game, but in large part it didn't require a huge amount of backtracking. There'd be some, but I think they really hit a good medium there. But like I said, what struck me was that the most replayable games, quote unquote, were actually the most completable games. They weren't the ones that were super hard, that were super sloggy. Obviously, the original Gears of War games, people talk about being, despite the fact that those had multiplayer instances, they're also remarkably fun, deep, single-player experiences with good narrative. The Halo games, the original Halo campaigns, I don't know how many times I've played. Many, to say the least, at least for the first three. Halo 1, 2, and 3. Played Reach. A little bit of ODST. I guess I played Halo 4, too. Another one I found interesting that popped up multiple times was the original Call of Duty Black Ops. Was considered very replayable. Again, not talking about the multiplayer, which is also really completable. The early Metal Gear Solids, so MGS 2 and 3, are considered very replayable. The Half-Life games, obviously, were talked about multiple times. Baldur's Gate came up, Dark Alliance, Dragon Age, Origins, Mass Effect. All these games that I've been talking about, Deus Ex, KOTOR, Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, the original, 1 and 2, the early Assassin's Creeds, Heroes of Might and Magic, Infamous. It's interesting as I'm reading these games, right, and I'm going through them, and I'm parsing through these, right? I'm not reading every single one I'm seeing. These are the ones that are showing up a lot. The theme, at least that I see, is not necessarily a incredibly powerful, well-designed replayability mechanic, right? There's nothing in those games that I've talked about. Usually they'll have one theme seems to be a darn compelling narrative, a fun world to inhabit. Honestly, and it sounds so simple, and I don't want to just leave it quite this simple, but those are all really good games. Those are all really core, good, feel-good games. When you play them, they feel good to play, right? Like, God of War is just an incredible achievement in making you feel very good killing things over and over. There's actually very simple... There's 2 buttons, basically, you can use. There's heavy and light attacks, combinations that you can do with that. Abilities, 1 or 2 adjusters in terms of holding down L1, kind of like a shift button that gives you a couple more. Very simple concepts, actually. And the game is, in large part, just killing everything you come across. A little bit of platforming here and there, some puzzle solving. In large part, it's killing stuff. Half-Life, 1 and 2. All things considered, pretty darn simple first-person shooter. Obviously, in terms of the physics and the gravity gun, were highly revolutionary and really cool and new. But in large part, it was just because they were done so well. They weren't the first game that ever tried physics. It was just the first one that did it fantastically. Gears of War was, at a time, the FPSs were first-person shooters were king due to Halo and Call of Duty. Gears of War was a third-person shooter that had incredibly dark and gritty aesthetic. It was very, very common in the mid to late 2000s. And had intensive kind of the cover-based system, right? And it was the first game that did that, and it was the best one. I mean, Halo kind of speaks for itself, right? The Metal Gear games are notorious for their ridiculously involved and impressive stealth systems, as well as their ability to be very, 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 very fun narratively. Really, really weird, quirky, basically like soap opera video games. I mean, what else did I say? Baldur's Gate, Far Cry, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, right? Mass Effect kind of being one of the early games that gave you the dialogue wheels, the social interaction, part of it being very, very accessible, very fun, very easy to do. These games just read as really good. So maybe, I guess maybe my question, or at least my thesis or final kind of thought that I have about this replayability as it relates particularly to building in these replayability grinds or big, huge, just making sure there's enough stuff to do. Maybe we shouldn't make sure there's enough stuff to do. Maybe you should make sure that the stuff that there is to do is so much fun you want to do it again. Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm way oversimplifying that. I'm sure I am. I know that's not easy to figure out, but God, it just seems, when you think about the things that you want to do again, it's because they were so good the first time. And all those games, again, to note, all have good narratives, but the reason you go back and replay them isn't just the narrative. It's a purely story-based game, say like, Heavy Rain or whatever. You don't go play that multiple times. The only reason you play that game again is because there are some branching choices in that game. And that is exactly a replayability mechanic put into the game so you'd replay it again. Because otherwise, it's just the story and you know the story. And that's what separates games from movies or books, is that, you have interaction. You can do it. There's an interactive rate. And all of those games were just really, really good at their core gameplay mechanic. So, I don't know. It's not. You don't have to certainly reinvent the wheel every single time you do that. I'm not saying the only good replayable games are ones that manage to hit this, just find their genre and then just perfect it. But I do think there's something to be said for the fact that, God, man, maybe you take Battlefront 2 and you make sure that the core shooting people part of it is really, really fun. And you don't stress and spend God knows how many developer hours on forming these incredibly complex multi-transactional, multi-currency progression systems that no one gives a damn about. Is that fun? Does anyone have fun sifting through that and making conversions and thinking about filling this bar up and making sure that you have enough to get this next thing so that you can fill another bar? Like, no, that's not fun. When you go back and rip something apart with your hands in God of War, that's fun. That's visceral, man. Those are my first M-rated games. Very, very special place in my heart for that. So, I don't know. I don't want to just be speaking to the choir here. I obviously agree with myself. But I also don't want to claim that I have, I'm some all-knowing game guru. I'm just a dude who likes games a lot. But I will say some of the evidence seems to tie into that, especially when I was talking about, so, that kind of comes back to this idea that, in Undertale, there's this place we can't go back to, and guess what? If we want to go back to that place, we have to play the game again. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's why that place was so good in the first place, was because you couldn't go back and replay it. Maybe that's why Doki Doki scared the shit out of us, and wouldn't have the same ability to do that again. Maybe that just requires the guy that made Doki Doki to now make another really good game, instead of just doing the same thing over and over. I don't know. Maybe I'm just old and crotchety and an idealist at heart, but honestly, I think that's the key to bringing people back. That and psychological marketing ploys that pull people into things that they don't really understand, aka the current state of games. Alrighty, before I get any more cynical, we're going to wrap this one up. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much for listening to me. This was actually very fun for me. I tend to just babble at myself anyway in my mind, so getting to do it out loud is very much fun for me. If you guys have any questions or thoughts, particularly about today's episode, feedback, if you never want to hear me do a solo cast again, please drop us a line at greg@gamingmechanics.com or mark@gamingmechanics.net. Haha! I figured that out right in time. It is both .net. I get that wrong every time, and I got it right this time. So, ha. As well as, obviously, following us on all of the socials, yada, 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 if you so choose. I think we are going to be streaming more this month, particularly Undertale. So tune in for that to see. Neither Mark and I think Mark's played through like where we are now and hasn't played any further. I hadn't seen the game at all. So it'll be a fresh run-through of Undertale, as we will be giving both just our natural reactions, but as well as trying to bring some of our gaming mechanics analysis in real time as we play. And stay tuned for subsequent weeks, as we will be talking more subsequently, or more concretely about endings in games, and final bosses, narrative endings, and why that seems to be such a hard thing to do. Join us next week, where both Mark and I will be here, and we'll get to hear both of our lovely, relaxing voices. Actually, Mark has a relaxing voice. I have a fine voice. In any case, that will wrap it up for tonight. I hope you guys have a wonderful week and a wonderful end of the year as we get closer and closer to 2018. That's it. I'm done. We're out. Peace.